are there any descendants? And sometimes lines, but with the Grants, all four of their children, Ulysses and Julia's children, did survive, and they all had children, and those children all had children. So there is quite a descendancy from U.S. Grant, and there's certainly surviving descendants, which we'll mention briefly, but we're going to concentrate on Ulysses S. Grant III, one of Grant's grandsons. It shows that there's a genuine interest, though, in the family line and how genetics plays out in terms of appearance, demeanor, even career choices. And so we'll look a little bit, you can kind of draw your own conclusions as to how U.S. Grant III's life mirrors his grandfather's to some extent. The more I studied this man, Ulysses Grant III, the more I saw of his grandfather in him. He displayed similar virtues and really espoused the same dedication and sense of duty that his grandfather did. He cared deeply for his family. He served his country selflessly and sought peace and unity in our country and abroad. In his final years, he also worked to record his family legacy and that of his country. I became increasingly in awe of the many contributions and accomplishments of this man. To some extent by his illustrious grandfather, he still earned a solid reputation and built an amazing career all on his own. We're only going to take a glance at this career because it's an incredibly extensive career. It honestly would probably be easier to list the things that he didn't do. So Ulysses Grant III, wrong way. Ulysses Grant III was born on the 4th of July, and this doesn't star Tom Cruise. He was born on the 4th of July in Chicago, where his mother's family, the Honors, had settled in the 1850s. His parents were the oldest son of Ulysses Grant, Frederick, and Ida Honor. I'll show you over here. This is Ida, and this is Frederick. And Ida's father Henry was actually a real estate magnate in Chicago at the time, so they had plenty of money. The reason I put this other lady over here, this is Bertha Palmer, Bertha Honor. It's actually Ida's sister, and she also married into a wealthy family, the Palmers, and so the children growing up early on would spend quite a bit of time at their aunt's house, and she would provide for them. So, but fairly early on in Ulysses Grant's, I'll call him Ulysses for the sake of making it easier. In Ulysses' life, he went to New York with his parents. The grandparents had come back. Ulysses and Julia had come back from their world tour in 1879. They were living, by 1881, they were living in New York City, and that's when the Fred Grant family and Ulysses moved out to live with the grandparents on 66th Street in New York City. Fairly early on, they did purchase their own place in Morristown, New Jersey, so northern New Jersey. New clicker. There we are. And so, but the real wonderful times that the family spent together in the early 1880s while the elder Ulysses was still alive was really spent at their Long Branch, New Jersey cottage on the seashore. In the summertime, they would go down there, and all three generations would gather. You have, of course, Grant and Julia, the patriarchs and matriarch, and then you have their daughter Nellie. You have Elizabeth, that's Jesse's wife, one of their other sons. This is Ida, that's Fred's wife. This should be Ulysses Grant III right there. This is his sister, I'm sorry, not sister, cousin Nellie. That's Jesse's daughter. They were both born in 1881. And then you have Julia, his sister, and born in 1876. And then you have a couple of Nellie's children. They were born in England, and she would come back from England to be with them. So this was a very happy family time, these early 1880s. And any memories that Ulysses III would have would be very fleeting because of his age, but this is where they would come from, either Long Branch and just up here on Mount McGregor, and just a little bit from their time in the winters in New York City home. One of the amusing tales that comes from their time here is when Ulysses was a little boy, they had a little garden patch out near the cottage in New Jersey, and all the kids were given a little plot in the garden, and he wanted to plant melons. So he planted a melon vine, and when he would see the first bloom or first flower on the melon vine, he'd run in to tell his grandmother, Julia, and inevitably the next morning there would be a fully grown cantaloupe or watermelon sitting under the vine. And then he would quickly grab it and run inside and sell it to his grandmama for 10 cents. So it was the magical vine. It was quite the family classic. They would keep that going for a few years. Ulysses III would also remember being carted around on his grandfather's shoulders. He would take him around the New York City home and show him the different trophies and things he had picked up on his world tour, the exotic things. He'd give him stories. And so he really felt that his grandfather was an incredibly doting grandfather, just loved his grandchildren, loved to spend time with them, and he had a knack for talking to the grandchildren as though they were adults, and they really did enjoy that. He wrote to his daughter Nellie, just in general, he said, "The fact is, Ma and I are very proud of our grandchildren." So he really did love his grandchildren, and that showed. During Grant's final illness, it was a very sad time for the family, a very anxious time for the family. One of the things that broke up a little bit of that was a couple of the... Grant himself had a humorous side, but also his son was a little bit mischievous. His little grandson, I should say, was a bit mischievous. Ulysses III, at one point, he was I should say first that the press was keeping a watch on the house. As soon as they found out that Grant was ill, in the winter of 84-85, they found out he was sick, they started watching the house 24 hours a day. So there would constantly be reporters, and even the little kids noticed this, including the little grandchildren, including Ulysses III. So one day, Ulysses III was with his nurse, and he was, well, behaving very badly. And so when his mother, Ida, got home, the nurse told him about it, but Ulysses wasn't there when she told him, when she told Ida. So Ida confronted her little boy and said to him, "I've heard you've been dreadfully naughty today. Now, isn't that terrible?" And the little boy responded, "Now, how did you hear that, Mama? Was it in the newspapers?" Clever little boy. The one evening, there was a bit of a startle. Most people were in their beds, and all of a sudden, they were awoken by a screaming child. And they ran upstairs to see what was the problem, and when everything calmed down, they asked, it was Ulysses III, and they asked him what was the matter. He said, I want an apple. And then Julia, grandmother Julia, she remembered. She had told him, "If you want anything, just shout." She didn't realize he would take it literally and do it in the middle of the night. Even Grant himself, even though he was sick, he still came to the door and was rather amused, actually, and liked the vigor and spirit of his sturdy little grandson, who bore his name. So, in the spring of 1885, Grant is very ill. He's signing some autographs on photos for his doctors as a gift. And as he's signing them, his son Fred says, would you consider signing a recommendation for your grandson to go to West Point, which again seems a little odd at 4 years old, but they knew that his time was short, and so he did. He wrote up this letter right here, and General Sherman was there, and he added, even though he didn't think it would matter much, he added his endorsement to the letter. So you have Grant, you have Sherman, all vouching for a 4-year-old boy, that he would be a good cadet for West Point. Maybe that's where some of that genetics expectations comes in. But you have, at the very bottom, we'll talk about it later, but you can see that it's actually fully endorsed by William McKinley. But that comes later. So that was really a final gift. It was a way for Grant, even though he wouldn't be around to see it, it was a way for his grandfather to really kind of help direct his life, but also give him opportunities when he got older. So it really showed that he really cared about his grandchild's future. So we come to Mount McGregor because, of course, at this point, Ulysses III is only 4 years old while this is going on. He doesn't have a lot of memories to write down. A couple of things he remembers, a little bit about, obviously they played games around the cottage. He didn't really understand the full gravity of what was going on, a child that age. Him and his sister had never encountered anyone passing away. They never went to a funeral before that. So they were really not really understanding what was going on. But they played around the cottage. Sam Willett was Grant's kind of impromptu bodyguard, who was a Civil War veteran himself, and he kind of made his job kind of watching over the grandchildren. So they would play in his tent, and he set up a swing for them. They would go and swim in Artist Lake, which is just over in the compound here. So they'd go swimming. So that's basically, that was their life up here with their grandfather. He was working on his book, and they were playing like children will do. After 4th of July comes around, and that's a very important time. Grant was up here from June 16th to July 23rd when he passed away. And when the 4th of July rolled around, it was an important date for the Grant family, because not only was it Ulysses III's birthday, but it was also his Aunt Nellie's birthday too. So they both were born on the 4th of July. Plus, of course, you have the anniversary of Vicksburg, the taking of Vicksburg during the Civil War for Grant. But of course, Grant was in such a poor state that they really couldn't do much in the way of celebration. So that just passed. He also recalled, Ulysses III, that the Army Guards came up, the Grand Army, the veterans of the Civil War, came up to guard the house and the train after his grandfather passed, and they actually were the first ones to introduce him to any kind of military practices. They let him, try the gun and hold the gun and the musket, and they showed him how to hold it, and they showed him how to stand, and so he got his first taste of the military from the veterans of the Civil War, the men who had served under his grandfather. So perhaps that was an early inspiration to join the Army himself. One night he recalled a terrible lightning storm. This is after his grandfather's passing, and it came into the nursery. The lightning came into the nursery and actually knocked little Ulysses over and burned the wallpaper. And fortunately, no one was harmed, but the nurse was very shaken up by it, to say the least. It took her a while to calm down, but that was a scary incident. They believed that somebody had taken a piece of the lightning rod for a souvenir, and that's why it didn't function properly, because souvenir seeking was really bad up here in the early days. So after his grandfather passed up here, the family would within a couple of years, would move off to Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's where they would live for a few years, from 1889 to 1893, and because Fred was appointed as the minister, the U.S. minister to Austria-Hungary at the time. It was a little difficult on Ulysses III because he had to go to a foreign-speaking school. He was the only American at the time, and this is the school he went to. It's still there today. It's called the Teresianum. So it was a foreign school, a little difficult, but he persevered. He showed, Grant pluck and character, and he persevered and went to his studies there. And so they lived there for a few years until 1893. They came back to the U.S. And Fred, his father, started working as a police commissioner in New York City, and he actually was serving with Teddy Roosevelt, who was also a police commissioner at the time in New York City. This is in the 1890s. Ulysses went to Cutler School of New York, which was actually a really nice prep school for getting into really nice colleges. So he went there for a few years, for about 3 years, and then he went for 1 year to Columbia University. But he did harbor this, desire to go into the military. And on June 30th of 1898, Ulysses was appointed to West Point Military Academy by President McKinley using that note that he had gotten from his grandfather from about, from the previous decade. While a cadet, he was permitted to leave, and I'll mention what this is. This really shows, it's called family ties. This shows that very early on, Ulysses III was a part of a family that made it an important part of their family to remember their ancestors, but also to go to the memorial openings. So here he is at 1896, a young man going to the unveiling of the Brooklyn U.S. Grant statue. So in 1897, some of us may know that they opened the U.S. Grant tomb down in New York City as well. So they were present at those. And you see, this is U.S. Grant III. We have his father. And one thing I really liked when I looked closer at this was it looks like his mother's quite proud of Ulysses standing out there. You can see her right there with just a beaming smile. You don't see those in the early pictures very often, but this was a bit of a candid shot. So from all I've read, she was a wonderful lady. Ida was a very good mother to her son. But it was really important for them to remember and keep the legacy alive, and we'll see more of that as we go along. So he was allowed to leave West Point for his sister's wedding. She married a Russian prince, and her name would change to Princess Kantashuzine. And she would move to Russia at some point, but then at another point they would be chased out during the Russian Revolution and come back to America, and she lived out her days here. But they had a good relationship. I don't see him in the photo. He was certainly there because he had to give away his sister because Fred, their father, was away in the Philippines during the Philippine War. This is right around the turn of the century here. Ulysses III would graduate West Point in 1903, and he did very well. Before he graduated, his father, Fred, was a little concerned and wrote one of his former professors about inquiring about his academic status. And I think it was kind of humorous. The response from this professor said, "Dear Fred, you needn't worry. The boy stands higher in everything than you ever did in anything." So, bit of a rebuff there. So Ulysses III did, arguably better than both his predecessors, both his grandfather and his father. You see him in the corner here, and the second one in here, and this image here is one of his classmates. Anybody? Guess?
Sherman?
MacArthur. You got it. Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur was his classmate, and he finished first in the class, but Ulysses was not far behind. He was sixth in the class. So he placed very well, and he was able to go into the Corps of Engineers because of that. So soon after, Grant goes to the Philippines for a short time because there was a resistance of the Moro people. This was after the initial push in the Philippine War, and they were on an island called Mindanao. And the resistance would go to 1913. Obviously, Ulysses III would not stay over there that whole time. But he would return to the United States, and he would become, after about a year there, and he would become an aide to the President Roosevelt. And while serving as an aide in the White House, the newspapers made sure to make a point that he was also in the same place was Lieutenant Philip Sheridan of the 5th Cavalry, which was the son of General Sheridan, and also Captain Fitzhugh Lee Jr., the grandnephew of Robert E. Lee. So he was serving alongside them in the White House. The papers thought that was kind of interesting. It was also where he would meet his future wife, Edith Root, who was the daughter of Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War, later Secretary of State, Senator, and even won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on arbitration. So a very well-known politician of the time. In 1906, he would go away again to, this time to the Cuban pacification. So the conflict was over in Cuba, but they still had to rebuild. They were building roads. They were trying to establish the peace. And so he went down there to establish the peace. So he's part of a peace force down there. And he spent about a year there before he came back, and that's when him and Edith got married. And the following 8 years, they would have 3 children. There's 2 in this image. I believe they are Edith and Clara, the first 2 children. The 3rd child would be Julia, that would come later on. But within 8 years, they would have all 3 of their children. He was in high demand as an engineer, and he would spend time out in Boston working on projects there. Then came back to Washington, D.C. as a superintendent of the War and Navy building in Washington, D.C., a massive, one of the biggest structures and biggest responsibilities in that whole Washington, D.C. complex. So he had a huge responsibility. Ulysses would lose his father in 1912, a little bit unexpectedly. He was ill, but he passed away pretty quickly of a heart problem in a hotel in New York City. His mother Ida would live until 1930. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, too, if you think you might forget them by the end. This is actually an interesting grouping. Before his father died, Fred here, this is standing in front of a building that's on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. And it's interesting because all 3 of the Grant men, his father became a major general before he passed away, and they all served on Governor's Island. So even the U.S. Grant the first and the subsequent 2. So they all, and this is where this photo was taken, and shortly before Fred's passing, and you see this is his wife Edith right here, and you have Ida, and I believe, does it say, I don't know who Francis Gibson is, but one of their friends, obviously. So after his father's passing, he would serve in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then he was sent to the Mexican border. As most military careers roll out, you're going to notice this. He gets moved around a lot, and he does a lot. To be honest with you, it really it makes my head spin. So he was fighting down in operations against Pancho Villa and the Mexican revolutionaries down in Mexico for 4 years. Before World War I came in, and during World War I, he served on the staff of General Tasker Bliss, which was the Supreme War Council during the Treaty of Versailles talks at the end, the peace talks. So that was really interesting because that's 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Interesting because, his grandfather had brokered peace about 50 years before at Appomattox. So here's a 3rd generation brokering peace. He's also was kind of a protection guard, or you could see him here and here. So this gentleman over here and here, that's Marshal Joffre. Joffre was the head commander of the French forces in World War I, and so he was kind of an international celebrity, and he came to visit. Here he is at the tomb, putting U.S. Grant III to sleep, I think. It does seem to be. That out of the way. So he was basically very well esteemed already in the military and given some very high positions of responsibility. And I'll be honest, in the next few decades, his career really makes my head spin. I mean, it's amazing what this man did and the things that he juggled. If the positions are even half as difficult as the titles are to say, the guy did a lot of work. And I'm really not going to try to pretend to understand or explain every single position that he had, because it was a lot, and it will just we're just going to go over the basic things that he did, and it would just take me hours to explain it all. The man was very talented, and he worked on a lot of projects throughout his career. Very impressive. Soon after World War I, he was stationed in California. He did some large engineering projects out there. He would come back east in 1923, and over the next few years in Washington, he would be involved in the Arlington Memorial Bridge, National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, director of the Office of Public Buildings and Public Parks of the National Capital. See how I told you there's some really long titles. They must mean you got to do a lot, I think. And he was in charge of the Park Police in Washington as well. So he had a lot on his plate over the next decade. During this time, though, he had an interesting encounter. A lady came to his, an elderly lady came to his office and in Washington, and the lady had said when she was young in the Civil War, she remembers she was at General Grant's headquarters, but she was a Southerner, and she remembers General Grant, his generosity, because she was trying to sneak food to a Confederate that they were hiding in the basement that was wounded. So they were trying to hide him in the basement of the Union headquarters, which is quite amazing. And when Grant kind of sniffed an issue and confronted her, she did say what was going on to him honestly, and instead of punishing or the household, he just said, let's bring him up and get him to the surgeon and take care of him. So again, very generous, and she wanted to find a descendant. She wanted to find somebody to tell this story to before she passed away. So it was really important to her to have somebody know this generosity that had been given to her, to obviously to an enemy at the time. Somehow during all this time, Ulysses III was able to go to the Army War College as well. And he graduated in 1934, becoming the director for the Civilian Conservation Corps for the Delaware District for 2 years during the Depression. So yet another thing he did. It just amazes me. It goes on and on. And this is him in 1932 with a descendant of Robert E. Lee's, Dr. George Lee. He's at the 42nd reunion of the Confederate veterans in Richmond, and they're dedicating the Richmond Battlefield Park, one of the earlier battlefield parks down there. So obviously he had a head for preservation very early into his career. That was something that was important, but of course it wouldn't be till the end of his career, we'll talk about it later, that he really jumped into it with both feet. He was
to Panama? Was he ever sent to Panama for the canal?
Not that I can tell. Although you would think so with an engineer, but no, he had other things going on, must be. He was chief of staff for the 2nd Corps, and that's when he was stationed in the 30s and 36. He was stationed in Governor's Island, like I was mentioning, like his two predecessors. 2 years later, he would actually host the largest peacetime war games. There's 50,000 military participants up in Plattsburgh, where they did, they staged tacticals, and so that was something his father Fred had done for many years too. In 1940, he was promoted to brigadier general, and he was made the division engineer for the Great Lakes Engineer Division. Again, so the responsibility level is continuing to rise. He must have been doing something right. He was soon after transferred to the command of the Engineer Replacement Training Center at Fort Leonard, Wood, Missouri. At this point, the World War II is starting to pick up, and he's going to be needed for that as well. When they entered World War II, because of his age at the time, he was actually picked to be chief of the protection branch of the Office of Civil Defense, which again, that's an incredibly large, that's the entire United States defense. I'm not sure if that would be something like Homeland Security. I don't know what it relates to today, but it would be a large undertaking. And of course, the threat of invasion in World War II was real, did happen technically, if you count things like Pearl Harbor and the roving boats and submarines off the coast. So it was we were expecting an invasion. So there was a lot of preparation to be done, building up the forts and everything around the United States. So he played a big role in that. During World War II, he actually was promoted to Major General in 1943. So that made him a third generation Major General for his family. And he would be, throughout his career, he would be honored by 6 different nations for his work, either at the peace talks in World War I or during his World War II time, or his times in Cuba, Philippines. So he had a really long and interesting career.
Well, we got a medal from Panama.
He got medals. Yep, he got medals from different places. He would receive also receive a civilian honor, an honorary degree from Hamilton College, up where he would end up kind of making his home in Clinton, New York, which is out just past Utica. So that's where he kind of settled. He stayed up in the Northeast.
Oh no.
And so he would also get numerous honors from different societies and institutions, including West Point and the American Legion. Retirement and preservation is the next step, and that's really a big change, a big shift in his life. He retires from the Army. He does serve as vice president of Washington University in Washington, D.C. For about 5 years. And he was 65 when he took that job, so he took that on and did it for 5 years. But immediately he started being more active in organizations like he was with the Red Feather Community Chest Campaign, kind of a more or less a Salvation Army style organization. So he was involved in civic and charitable groups. He would help biographers. He had a lot of information, and at this time there wasn't any U.S. grant papers available. The bits and pieces of information you had to take from questionable sources. So he helped a lot of folks, including people like Bruce Catton, very important Civil War historians and authors, with their works to try to help them understand his grandfather better. In 1949, Ulysses made a return visit here to Grant Cottage. I'm not quite sure if that was the first visit he made since he was a child. It's possible, but he did frequent other Grant historic sites around the country, as we'll see in the next couple of slides. But this is him standing in Grant's bedroom inside the cottage here in 1949 with the caretaker, C.A. Narita. Which it's interesting because it's 1949, it's just past World War II, and of course C.A. Narita was a Japanese woman who actually was forced to be under house arrest here because of her heritage. She had not gotten U.S. citizenship, but she did receive citizenship after the war. And I'm sure he deeply appreciated her contribution to this place when he was here. He would come for a memorial service that year on May 1st, and he would have a chance to speak and tell some stories, the little bit he remembered about his father. But he remembered his father as a man basically who was unselfishly patriotic and modest. That was his main remembrances of his grandfather. So he poured all his efforts, once he was out of the college game, he poured all his efforts into preservation, and he visited more than once some other sites like Hardscrabble. You can see in the background, that's the Hardscrabble cabin in St. Louis, Missouri that his grandfather had built on the Whitehaven plantation back in the 1850s, and it still existed. And this is him with apparently a Gatling gun that was sitting out front of the place, which is kind of interesting. So he's inspecting the Gatling gun, as any engineer would. So he would go on to serve on the National Trust. He would be a founding member of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, president of the Columbia Historical Society, later on the Washington, D.C. Historical Society, commander-in-chief of the Sons of Union Veterans, and the Military Order Loyal Legion. So you're talking about all this going on in the 1850s into the 1860s. This is an enormous amount of things he's getting involved with. On top of all that, he also got involved with, and I think it shows his appreciation for and recognition of the importance of immigration into America, because he was a chairman of the National Committee of the American Museum of Immigration. And where they wanted to put the museum was in the base, the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. And it's interesting because 70 years before, his father had actually helped raise funds to get the base ready for the statue to be delivered. So it took a long time, well after he passed away, but in 1972 they did make the Immigration Museum in the pedestal. Richard Nixon opened it in 1972, so it did succeed eventually, but those things do take time, and I think he understood that. But one of the biggest things he undertook, and of course there was a focus on him because he was involved in those organizations like the Sons of Union Veterans, to be part of a Civil War Centennial Commission. It was time to take a look back, a time to remember. The last of the Civil War veterans were passed away. It was a time to remember. And he went to Congress, and in the House subcommittee, he said in 1957, trying to get the different things through Congress that needed to go through to establish this commission, he said, "What better lesson in patriotism and self-sacrifice for a cause can be given to our children of today and future generations than to teach them what Americans did in those days of crisis and greatness? We today cannot do better than to emulate the patriotism and self-sacrifice of the men and women who fought that war." So I think it's somewhat interesting because that's the kind of attitude we took to our recent event that the Friends of Grant Cottage put on down in Wilton. I don't know if was anyone able to attend that? The Civil War reenactment. Well, we're hoping to turn it into at least a biannual event. But it's portraying what happened and teaching people what happened. And so I think that's the same spirit that he had in regards to the Civil War commemoration. The only problem was that even 100 years later, there was still two separate versions of the war being taught in the North and in the South. So this did bring some friction, and unfortunately, Ulysses was forced to leave the commission in 1961 after a controversy, which was really a bigger problem than him. He wasn't the controversy. It was the fact that they had an event down in Charleston, South Carolina. They had events in the North, and then they had an event at Fort Sumter in Charleston, and one of the delegations of the commission was an African-American lady, and she was not allowed to rent a hotel room. So things got out of hand, and unfortunately, he ended up, on top of all that, having to leave to take care of his sick wife, who passed away the year after anyway. In 1962, Edith would die. And so it was a very difficult time for him either way, but he did everything he could for years to prepare for this centennial, and he did get a lot done ahead of time to get people to understand and get ready for this centennial to be celebrated. He would really share the good and bad with his grandfather. This is another image showing, this is also in 1961. He was really making the rounds. This is him in the Galena home, and they had just renovated it, and they're having a 19th century dinner right in the home. And so with U.S. Grant III at the head of the table there. And as I was mentioning before, there was this went on for years. I mean, in 1950 they're doing the Appomattox dedication, and then 11 years later they're sitting in Charleston, South Carolina, where things kind of fell apart. But that's the table from That's the table from Appomattox. So, and the two men you have here are Ulysses Grant III, same men in each picture, and this is Robert E. Lee the fourth. So there wasn't a real attempt to create this as a unifying project, this commission. Grant would suffer, Grant would have a lot of things he shared with his grandfather. He would have a good proficiency for math. A little bit more in drawing attention. We can't leave out John Wayne. You get a picture of John Wayne, you got to have him. So we got John Wayne getting this is before the 61 issue. This is him getting a citation from the commission because they did a movie that kind of alluded to the Civil War a little bit. So anything to draw some attention to the Centennial was something he was willing to do. And who wouldn't want to shake John Wayne's hand, you know? How many people have seen the Horse Soldiers? There you go, yeah. I don't think I don't know if I have. I'll have to watch it again. So again, he went around. He's going to Lincoln's tomb, Lincoln Memorial. He made the rounds to try and drum up interest in the Centennial. It's interesting because if you look at, I may be reading too much into this, but if you look at his face and Lincoln's face, there's kind of a similarity in, I think, the expression. There's kind of a caring, but also a real strong character you can kind of read in behind it, like a good reserve of strength. So it's kind of interesting how that worked out. And as we mentioned, Fort Sumter, the Civil War Centennial, we mentioned this already, that there was a controversy, unfortunately. This is him going over a script for a speech that was that created a lot of the unrest in the event down there. This newspaper reporter and speaker was kind of shouted down during his speech, and they wanted Ulysses III to refute what he had said, and he wouldn't do it. So again, a little bit of controversy, which was not something his grandfather didn't have to deal with as well. So they both dealt with controversy. They both had to deal with migraine headaches. They both had a very strong sense of duty, but also, again, a higher level of scrutiny because of their position. They would both serve in multiple wars, but were at the core desirous of peace more than anything. They would both try to heal the nation of the divisions that threatened it, and they would both encounter insurmountable odds, though they did push the line further. They both tried to push the line further. In 1967, as an 84-year-old, Ulysses sat at an awards ceremony in his honor, and he listened as U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Harold Johnson tried to sum up the legacy he was about to leave a year later. For more than a century, the Grant family has given more than its share of public service to this nation. The career of Major General Ulysses S. Grant III has lent further continuity to the tradition of that distinguished family. Commissioned in 1903 when tactics involved movement on foot and horseback, he has seen the horse displaced by the armed vehicle and air cover. His imagination, superior intellect, and keen insight were equal to this transition. His active duty included service in Cuba, Veracruz, and spanned 2 world wars, but his contributions to our country did not cease with retirement. Not only has he been recognized for distinguished service in the field of education, as Vice President of George Washington University, but also donated much of his time to assisting civic and patriotic organizations. It is the desire that this well-deserved recognition will serve to inspire others to follow your example. Ulysses would pass away the following year in 1968 in Clinton, New York, at his home. Only a couple hours drive from here, really. So not far from where his grandfather spent his final time.
He had lung cancer at 63. Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes, yeah, his grandfather did, yes, yeah. So before he passed away, though, he had a mission. just like his grandfather did, and that was to clear his grandfather's name. He felt as though things were slipping away. In his beginning part of his preface to his book, he wrote specifically to his children. He wrote to his 3 daughters and any other descendants. He wrote, "The great, whose reputation rests on a true record of their accomplishments, have a right to expect that some of their descendants will attempt to set the record straight when it seems to be slipping too far from the truth." And by this time, it was slipping very far from the truth. So he went ahead and wrote an entire biography of his grandfather. Ulysses S. Grant, Warrior and Statesman, was published, just like his grandfather's work, was published the year after he passed away. I like to think, and I should mention too, that he not only left 3 daughters, he had 12 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren when he passed away. And of course, you know, I believe he really did hope that they would keep the legacy going of the Grant family and try to give people a better perspective and understand his grandfather more. I like to think that here at Grant Cottage, we also do the Grant family legacy justice by trying to tell as accurately as possible the true story of an American hero and his family. Should we not look to our ancestors and their lessons, good or bad? Is their story not worth saving? Ulysses did, and so do the Grant descendants to this day. After his passing, immediately after his passing, his daughter Edith took up the torch and took his position on the U.S. Grant Association. So it was an association that formed to again, protect that legacy and save it. At a recent gathering of this organization, just this past year, there was a gathering of Grant descendants. And it occurred at the annual meeting at the U.S. Grant Presidential Library, which is in, anybody? Mississippi State University. They've just completed within the last year, they've completed a whole museum wing onto it too. So now there's a museum, a research center, and a library dedicated to Grant, and also there's a section on Lincoln as well. So that is how things have grown over the years. But at this meeting that happened here, there was a panel of Grant descendants. There was a gathering. And it was called, the panel discussion was called Growing Up Grant. And I certainly would recommend it. It was recorded and put on Facebook through MSU, Mississippi State University. So if you're able to get through onto Facebook and find that video, it's a wonderful, about an hour long, and it was moderated by Ulysses Grant Dietz. That was the son of Ulysses III's daughter, Julia. So he is still obviously with us. Ulysses Grant Dietz. He's a grandson of Ulysses Grant III, and he has been involved with both the tomb and the Friends of Grant Cottage in the past, trying to help preserve his not only his great-great-grandfather's history, but the whole family legacy as well. So the legacy is still being passed down to the generations, and it will continue.